Okay. If you can't hear me, there'd be two reasons for that. One is that I've got a cold, so my voice is going. And the other is that at the best of times, I manage to speak very quietly, so people can't hear me. So shout if you can't hear me. I was in Washington in the early Reagan years and in Moscow in the late Gorbachev years, and when I was in Washington, I used to get into trouble coming back home in the early 1980s, and my liberal friends would say, "What do I think of Reagan?" And I say, "I think he's a very good president," and they'd say, "What? That cowboy?" But actually, he was a very, very interesting man, and of course, so was Gorbachev. On the subjects we're going to be talking about, I was a comparative outsider. There are people here, and Jack Matlock, when he turns up, who know far more about what went on than I did. And one of my purposes here today is to try and find out more about the things I don't understand myself. Somebody asked me last night why I called this the Second Cold War. I thought it was a term in general use for the early part of the 1980s. Timothy Ashton Garnett wrote in his diary for 1980 that he expects a nuclear war sometime in the next decade. It was quite a tense period. There's a paradox about the whole of that period, the belief in deterrence. Each side, the point of deterrence is that you believe the other man is so terrified he won't do anything silly. That's what deterrence is about. There's a risk, of course, that you're terrifying him exactly into doing something very foolish, but the purpose is you believe he's terrified. And the oddity about the period was that neither side seemed to be able to understand that the other side really was terrified. And I find that an interesting question. Why was that so difficult for each side to understand? Now, the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s, was the end of détente. And the Americans concluded that détente, I think they simply concluded that détente was a one-way game that only favored the Russians. And they started a more assertive policy, which started with Carter, not Reagan. And if you look at, I found it fascinating looking at all the top-level policy documents during the Cold War, starting in 1948, the American ones, and for the purposes of today, ending with Carter's PD 59. What strange documents they are. They admit from the beginning, they're all about what the Soviets up to and what do they want. They admit from the beginning they have no intelligence on that question, because getting intelligence on somebody else's intentions is either difficult or impossible. So they construct a whole lot of arguments which are based on public statements by Soviet officials and generals on the classics of Marxism, Leninism, and Stalinism. And the culminating example of that, of course, is Richard Pipe's Team B report from 1976 or so, which is sort of fantasy in my view from beginning to end. There's a problem, of course. On the one hand, the Americans and we had far too little information about what was going on in Moscow, so we had to make things up. And the Russians, if you tried to assess American intentions, the Russians, and for that matter, America's allies, had far too much information. It was all contradictory. It was leaked from different competing agencies. And working out where all this was going to net out was actually one of the amusing things we did in the British Embassy in Washington, trying to work out what the Americans actually were up to. In considering the PD 59, which was the Carter document, Marshal Schulman, who was then the State Department's Russian advisor, said this is based on the statements of Soviet generals. US generals also say silly things in public, and he said we may be placing more weight on the Soviet literature than is warranted, and I think that's quite true. I think the problem in evaluating that is that we have now a huge amount of stuff about what was going on the Soviet side, but we don't, as far as I know, Julian might know, somebody might know, have the equivalent documents. We don't have top-level politico-military strategic documents from the Soviet side. So we can't see whether the Soviet documents were as unbalanced and ridden with ideology as the Americans one. I suspect they were, but we don't know that. So then we start with Reagan. And Reagan starts by expanding the Carter military buildup. And then there's the thing about which I would like to know more, which was the so-called PSYOP, psychological operations, which Reagan ordered from March 1981 onwards. And what they consisted of was, I think you could reasonably say, extremely provocative operations by American aircraft and ships right up to the Soviet border, deliberately intended to unsettle the Russians' nerves and to test their defenses. They'd fly up to the border and turn around and come back again. And that went on from 1981 until 1983, at any rate. I've got a question which I'd like to put to Jack, but he's not here, but somebody else may know the answer. One of the things that seems to emerge, one of the things why the CIA started getting their assessments wrong, was that they didn't know this stuff was going on, and I wonder how many people in the administration did know about the PSYOPs. I don't think there's very much written about them, but it seems to me they are significant. And then you had, of course, the Evil Empire speech, and one of the things about the Evil Empire speech was that it wasn't at all original. Polemics about godless communism started in the 1920s, and they're a regular theme in American public discourse, but they also seep into these policy documents I was talking about, which are highly ideological and eschatological, you might say. Then you have, and one of our colleagues has written about it, the, in my view, absurd controversy in 1982 and 83 in Washington about Minutemen vulnerability. The arguments about that were surreal, in my view, at the time. But it heightened the feeling of fear and distrust. And then there was Star Wars. All that was accompanied in Washington at that time, which is rather forgotten, by massive anti-nuclear demonstrations in America. People remember the ones in Europe, which were going on at the time, but they don't mention very much. One of the biggest demonstrations, matched only by the anti-Iraq war demonstration in London in 2003, was the demonstration in New York of 1 million people in favor of a nuclear freeze. Huge public awareness. So, the Russian reactions, and Anatoly will have much more to say about this than I do, but all this fed Russian fears that the Americans were up to something, that they might attack or do something really silly. And there was a very interesting conversation. Reagan sent, and it's significant that he sent an emissary to talk to Andropov in the summer of 1983, and Andropov explained how worried he was at the situation and how much he feared that the two sides might stumble into war by miscalculation. What I don't know is what impact that expression of concern had on the American administration. My impression is that it was almost ignored, but I may be quite wrong about that. So you have all this stuff going on. The Russians start this operation Ryan, the intelligence operation, to pick up indicators that the Americans are about to make a surprise attack, which has been slightly laughed at in the West as being evidence of Soviet paranoia, but I think that's to dismiss it too much. And then you had, of course, in September, the shooting down of the Korean airliner. In my view, the shooting down of the Korean airliner was a tragedy, and it showed incompetence on part of the Soviet air defense authorities, but it was a not unsurprising consequence of the PSYOPs. This stuff coming in, airplanes coming in all the time. So this airplane came in, and it was the wrong airplane. And the atmosphere was heightened by Reagan's reaction when he called it an act of barbarism born of a society which wantonly disregards human rights. Now, that was strong language. The Russians' reaction was very confused, but airliners get shot down. It was 5 years later that the USS Vincennes shot down an Iranian airliner. These things happen. But it was after that, or in connection with that, that Andropov, who was by then General Secretary, abandoned hope for an evolution in a positive evolution in American-Soviet relations. Excuse me. Then in November you had the culmination of the annual NATO exercises, Able Archer, which lasted for about 5 or 7 days in early November. And it was the culmination of a series of exercises which each year involved Americans sending large numbers of troops across the Atlantic. And the culminating point of the exercise was the agreement by NATO to release tactical nuclear weapons for a strike. Now, it was an exercise. Both we and the Russians had a theory, because we were just as paranoid as the Russians, that if the other side mounted a bolt from the blue, it could easily be under cover of an exercise. Now, I don't believe anybody ever intended to mount a bolt from the blue. It would have been an absolutely absurd thing to do, but that's what we thought. So that's what the Russians thought, and they responded by additional deployments and alerts and more intelligence coverage to Able Archer. Now, the interesting thing, which is to me interesting and to some others present, was how the CIA analysts reacted to that. The CIA analysts said that Soviet actions are not inspired by, and Soviet leaders do not perceive, a genuine danger of imminent conflict or confrontation with the United States. And they said that the Soviet countermoves during Able Archer were probably a bluff to cover aggressive Soviet action somewhere else. The British weren't quite so sure of that, partly because of Gordievsky, and Mrs. Thatcher sent British officials to Washington to explain why, and Oliver Wright, our ambassador, was sent in to talk to Lawrence Eagleburger and was more or less ignored. But what happened in October was that after 25 years, the National Security Archive in Washington finally managed to extract from the American government the 1990 report of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board on this business. And it was highly critical of the analysts in general. It pointed to their lack of any hard intelligence for the conclusions they came to. More interesting, I think, was it showed the conceptual weaknesses. I think it's a very interesting document if you're interested in the whole business in general of intelligence assessment. The conceptual weaknesses they suffered from, and their failure, which was partly a question of mindset, to take the Soviet reactions seriously. And the President's Advisory Board concluded that the Americans, quote, inadvertently might have put their relationship with the Soviet Union on a hair trigger. That's in 1983. And Robert Gates, in his memoirs, said it was a horrible miscalculation. And he asked the interesting question, which is also true about groupthink and all that, interesting point. To what degree was our skepticism about the war scare prompted by the fact that our military didn't want to admit that one of its exercises might have been dangerously, if inadvertently, provocative, or because our intelligence experts didn't want to admit that we had badly misread the state of mind of the Soviet leadership. This is the former head of the CIA. Now, that crisis over Able Archer is sometimes said to be as bad a crisis as Cuba. I think that's a considerable exaggeration. But it does show that Russian paranoia, which existed, was nevertheless, as paranoia can be, fueled by events in the real world. I think the interesting thing then, and again I'd like to know what Jack has to say about it, seems that Reagan did have, Jack argues, a consistent policy towards the Soviet Union of trying to get alongside and reduce the tension. But what is striking is that it seems to be at that moment, after Able Archer, immediately after Able Archer, that he began to see or understand more about what the Russian reaction was to it all. The first thing was he watched the film which we watched in Washington, which was shown on television, called The Day After, which if you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It's about the day after a nuclear attack and what happens. And he was deeply depressed when he saw it. And then he wrote in his diary, maybe the Russians are scared of us and think we're a threat. He couldn't conceive, and this was the problem I think with the CIA analysts, that however much we knew we weren't going to attack the Russians, they could never be sure. Obviously, they couldn't be sure, and they planned as we did for the worst case. And so the question I'd like to ask Jack is, Reagan, who was a great instinctive politician who had a feeling for things and people and their, just why didn't he appreciate that the Russians were likely to be as afraid of us as we were as them? Well, then Thatcher introduced him to Gordievsky. He started to rethink the thing, and he concluded that the level of rhetoric should be reduced, and then Gorbachev turned up, somebody with whom he too could do business. And the rest is somebody else's story. Thank you.